So on this video, I wanted to discuss the recent retiring of Dominick Cruz, who is a former WEC champion and UFC champion. He's also a commentator for the UFC. Super high level mixed martial artist, and he's been plagued with injuries throughout this whole career. And I think he was trying to have one last fight, kind of a going away fight, his last fight in the UFC, and he ended up injuring his shoulder, dislocating his shoulder, and decided to retire. So shoulder dislocations represent 50% of joint dislocations in the human body. So very common, most commonly dislocated joint. And a reason for that is the shoulder has a lot of mobility. The shoulder moves in so many different ranges. And so in physical therapy, sometimes we say increased mobility, decreased stability. So the more movement, the more avenues of movement a joint has, the less stable that joint's going to be, so more susceptible it'll be to injuries. So here's a quick video of Dominick kind of talking about the result of this injury. And this is from the Anik and Florian podcast, and I think through the Instagram.
About 8 weeks prior to this recent one that I posted, I rehabbed it for 6 weeks straight, and then I went and sparred with Jeremy Stevens, a few other pro boxers, just to see where it was really at after the rehab I had done, and I did really well. I felt really good. After that, I booked the fight, and then...
So just to interject real quick, if you have a dislocation, and just because the shoulder goes back in doesn't mean it's ready. It may feel kind of decent, pain may go down, but it doesn't mean that some damage hasn't been done. And so again, you're more susceptible to re-injuries, and that's kind of what we're getting into here with Dominick's story.
They offered me Rob Font, so that's why I was like, oh, I should just take it. I'm not going to get in better shape. I've been training really hard. I felt amazing before the second dislocation. That's why I took the fight. So sorry, Rob Font, as well. I respect the guy, so nobody wants to pull out. But I knew I was on borrowed time, to put it quickly. So I was like, as long as I get through this camp, just stay semi-safe. Well, the day I needed to do a little bit of live, it just shot out the back the second I put my elbow down and went to pull in that single leg. And the difference with this one...
So he said he kind of went for a single leg. And so let's talk a little bit about kind of different injuries, how these injuries can occur in grappling. So in jiu-jitsu, in martial arts, in mixed martial arts, essentially like a couple different ways. I think that he planted or based on the shoulder and it dislocated. He said backward out the back. That's an uncommon way for shoulders to dislocate. Usually it's an anterior. So if you see the shoulder will come forward, that's the most common way of a shoulder to dislocate. Now, a couple different ways that can happen. If you have maybe you have a faulty break fall. So like Nicholas Marigali, for example, injured his shoulder during ADCC against Michael Pixley, and what happened was he basically planted his arm, and just the way the force was put through the shoulder, it dislocated. Another one could be, and I have had people I've worked with in the clinic before, where they are going in for a single leg takedown. So they're going for a takedown and somebody heavily sprawls, and what it does is shoots their shoulder down, like the ball joint goes down, and they can dislocate. Somebody puts heavy hips on the shoulder. Situation where somebody can wrench on the shoulder. You may have an underhook that's kind of lazy or a little bit weak. Somebody has an overhook and they can kind of wrench down, and again, causing that torque on the shoulder, cause the dislocation. So that can kind of happen. Some of those mechanisms are the way that it can occur for us grapplers or jiu-jitsu athletes or mixed martial artists. Again, I've seen it even, I'm sure some of you guys have seen it, where somebody throws a punch and they overextend on a punch and then they dislocate as well. What happens with a dislocation? There's numerous things, numerous injuries that can occur. But again, once you have one dislocation, you are more susceptible to more dislocations. So this article here it basically gives an overview on shoulder dislocations. We'll go through it briefly. And a couple of things, like they talk about, like I mentioned, 50% of all major dislocations occur in the shoulder. And then the anterior, the forward dislocation, is the most common. The reason why, we talk about you have more mobility, less stability, but also another reason that this is common is you have the glenoid. So that's like the capsule that the shoulder sits in. And then you have the humeral head, which is actually the ball joint. That's kind of shallow a little bit and allows for a lot of that movement. But also because of that shallowness, there's not the shoulder isn't as secure. The joint's not as secure. So we talked about the way that the shoulder can dislocate forward, backward, and downward. You can have a partial dislocation where part of the ball joint's kind of moved out, and then you have a complete dislocation where the ball joint's completely out of that socket.
From the first one was only out for like maybe 3 minutes. It was a nice quick slide back in. That was excruciating pain, but it was so quick. Whereas the second.
So Dominick talks about the first dislocation, popped out for like 3 seconds, had an easy time getting it back in to the socket. So it wasn't as bad of an experience. But the second one was the one that kind of freaked him out. And he's going to talk about that briefly here.
Second one, they went to pull it in and it did not go back. It just stayed where it was at. I'm in the hospital for an hour, 15 minutes. My arm starts turning blue. When I see my fingers turning blue and just things being weird and the pain was excruciating, it just gave a different perspective for me.
So we'll get into this in just a minute, but basically when you do have a dislocation, various things get stretched, pulled, torn, damaged, sometimes fractured. So what he's talking about, his hand turning blue, he could have had some kind of vascular injury. So something to the blood supply in the shoulder that goes down the arm. So because of the traction, could be the pressure of the shoulder where it was sitting, where the ball joint was sitting and putting pressure on maybe certain nerves. And he also had a really hard time getting the shoulder relocated. So it kind of probably freaked him out pretty bad, which makes sense. You start losing sensation or having circulation issues in your arm. You don't want to lose your arm, don't want to lose function of your arm, and really freaked him out. And I think that makes perfect sense. And Dominick's a super tough competitor and has had so many injuries. So, I think he kind of knew this was his last run, his last time to get on that UFC octagon, that stage, and just couldn't make it happen, which sucks for him. But he's had a hell of a career, which is pretty cool to watch.
How much is my shoulder worth? How much is being able to do this worth? More than what I'm getting paid for this last fight? Definitely. Now, if they offer me, a couple mil or something like that, I don't know. I might have showed up with a 50% arm. You got to figure out what your arm's worth.
It's talking about risk versus reward, essentially, not losing function of his arm, not losing function of his shoulder. So I want to go a little bit into the research and kind of discuss, we kind of mentioned how the injuries can occur, but let's talk about kind of what type of damage can occur in the shoulder. And then also some ideas on returning back to jiu-jitsu, returning back to sport. As you can see with that video, Dominick had his shoulder pretty well, like kind of down, and looked like it was dislocated, kind of out of the socket. And so that can occur, obviously, popping sensation, not always. You can have a history of like sudden onset of pain, and then you can't move the arm very well. And then also you can actually feel the joint moving out of the socket. So there's some things that can happen. So initially after this happens, we want to assess for some nerve issues. And so the axillary nerve is the most common nerve, kind of runs in the deltoid and kind of down into some of those areas in the shoulder, on the outer shoulder. So you want to make sure that, because 40% of dislocations, they could have some issue to the nerve. And as that shoulder gets relocated, the nerves that sensation goes away with when you have it reduced. So again, something to be mindful of. And the other thing is that you can have a fracture. So one of the injuries that can happen is a fracture, and that can be common and occur about 25% of those dislocations. So briefly, let's talk about what can happen, what kind of injuries we just discussed. The fractures in the shoulder can occur. Again, then you can have certain lesions, so-called Bankart lesions. So the cartilage, the labrum, which is like the cartilage in the shoulder, that can get torn or damaged by the forces that occur. So part of the ball joint, it's called a Hill-Sachs deformity. So that ball joint, part of that can actually get fractured, and that can obviously cause some issues with mobility and function of the shoulder. And then you can also have some in the front of the shoulder, front and inner area of the shoulder, called a reverse Hill-Sachs. So just kind of you can have some fractures there, and then damage to the cartilage. And also, again, you can have some damage to the rotator cuff as well. That's not uncommon to have with these types of injuries. So I'm sure some of you guys have seen, like in a fight, the shoulder dislocates of a fighter, and the corner's like tugging on it and trying to, relocate the shoulder back. That's not, obviously in a fight, you're going to do what you can to stay in the fight, but you should always get it relocated or performed by a professional. That may include going to the emergency room, but also if you have a skilled professional on staff. I'm going to show you a video of Dr. Ethan Kreiswirth actually relocating somebody's shoulder at a jiu-jitsu tournament. Ethan's very, very experienced, knows what he's doing, knows to assess the shoulder properly and how to do that. And so here's a video of him kind of doing that, relocating the shoulder. You can see the shoulder there. Still kind of, he's putting his foot there to kind of create some spacing and some traction. And then you'll see it pop right there. Boom, there it is. It pops right back in. So very cool. Ethan's so skilled, and just he's on the jiu-jitsu mats all the time. He's a black belt himself. And so watching him do that technique again, you can see he kind of uses a technique where he puts his foot into the armpit almost to create a little bit of a traction and get that shoulder back into position. So Ethan's super skilled. I would not recommend you just go have your buddy at the gym relocate the shoulder for you. Not a great idea. Have somebody that knows what they're doing, that's trained in emergency medicine, and that know how to assess for safety to make sure that it's okay to relocate the shoulder. Just want to touch on one more thing, why it's important to be safe and working with a medical provider that understands what to do. When you're evaluating the shoulders, you want to make sure that the axillary nerve is the most common. You want to make sure that you're aware of any kind of nerve involvement, and it's common in 40% of dislocations. The other thing is you want to make sure that you assess for fractures, because again, fractures can occur in about 25% of dislocations. So that's really important to think about as well. You don't want to be relocating the shoulder on your own without any kind of medical, assessment. If you have a dislocation, you are at a higher risk of, again, re-dislocating the shoulder. So that's very important to think about. And if you look at in the younger age group, the risk of recurrence correlates strongly to the violence of the initial injury and the age. So 16 to 30-year-olds are at a higher risk for re-injury. And then you also have older adults, 60 and older, I think around there, that they also are a little bit of a higher risk as well. Many patients will also develop arthritis in that shoulder, even if they don't have recurrent dislocation. So even one dislocation can lead to arthritis and arthritic changes in that shoulder after dislocation. Now, let's talk about kind of getting back to sport, return to sport. So a couple factors you got to think about, right? We got to talk about healing time. So depending on the extent of the injury, you have to give your tissue enough time to heal. Again, that can vary on the extent of the injury. But again, starting the process with rehab and working with a rehab provider, a physical therapist, is the best strategy. Myself being a physical therapist, I've seen these dislocations and in the clinic and worked with jiu-jitsu athletes and grapplers. And you have to start with conservative management and trying just to regain full range of motion. A lot of times after initial injury, you're going to have stiffness. You may be in a sling for a bit until, your symptoms kind of start to get more calm, depending on, again, the injury. But once you are able to start moving the shoulder, you want to start to regain full range of motion. So that's number one. So you want to obviously have the proper healing time for the tissue to heal. And then we want to start working on building adequate range of motion again, and then building good strength. So you want that shoulder to be nice and strong in all ranges. And one of the things when you're working with a sports physical therapist or someone that understands grappling, you have to obviously just begin with the very safe movements, very safe directions. And then you have to advance that, and you have to strengthen areas where you are vulnerable, some of which may be with your arm out here in this position. So you have to strengthen and do different type of specific joint training. I'm FRC trained, so functional range conditioning. And so I do a lot of end range strengthening. I strengthen at length and to length. So I'm strengthening it isometrically in different ways to build stability, to provide confidence and comfort and strength at these ranges where you're vulnerable to re-injure. So you want to kind of work in the positions where you're vulnerable. Again, you start that gradually. You work your way from like a very safe position next to the body, creating full range of motion, then building just general strength, and then working in some of those positions that you're more likely to get injured in. So once we've kind of gone through the initial rehab process, we've got good resilience, good stability in the shoulder, good strength in the shoulder. We want to start returning back to sport. And we do that very gradually. one thing is you want to make sure that you can get into the positions that are required. Maybe you're in someone's closed guard, and you have their hands on their chest or on their sternum. You're able to plant on the floor. You're able to pull and push. And you're able to get in certain positions that are required for jiu-jitsu, basing up or coming up onto the arm if you're doing like a butterfly position, or doing something where you're going for a half guard or an underhook. You want to get comfortable doing those things. So that's going to be something you're going to work. Hopefully, if you're working with a rehab provider that understands jiu-jitsu or grappling, you're going to work some of those positions in, maybe solo drills, and then very light partner drills. And then you're going to work into actual techniques. We're going to start using techniques and trying to hit techniques, not just getting into positions. We're going to start to work into those specific techniques that we want to do. And then we build that confidence and we start that gradual return to sport. So super important. Do that in a way, and everybody's going to be different. It depends on like we said, the severity of your injury. It depends on your age, how good your rehab's been going. All those things are vital for your recovery process. And, it's important to be mindful with your training partners, how hard you train, build that confidence, build that tolerance, and get back to training safely. Because at that point, you are now more vulnerable to recurrent injuries. And as Dominick Cruz showed, they can get pretty severe and they can be career enders for some of us. But the main thing, hopefully this was helpful. The point I want to make is work with a rehab provider, someone that understands how to properly rehab your injury and also how to get you back to the activity that you want to do. If it's jiu-jitsu or grappling, work with someone that trains. They're going to understand the mechanics and the requirements of those techniques and the sport itself. So again, appreciate you guys. Here's a quick picture of Dominick Cruz being himself, flicking off the camera. Yeah, he's a funny dude. Best of luck to him. And if you have questions, please reach out. jiu-jitsu-therapist at gmail.com, or you can shoot me a message on Instagram. I'll be happy to give you some help if you need it. Talk to you guys next time.